Welcome to General Psychology, Chapter 1. I'd like to start this particular chapter, which is the science of psychology, by asking you a couple of questions. How is it that we know what we know? Dependence on observation, first of all, is one of the hallmarks of science, but it's not the only way that we acquire knowledge. There are, in fact, many ways that we can answer how it is that we encounter knowledge, but there's also other ways that we cannot answer scientific questions. And often there's no way of acquiring the knowledge that we need. Sometimes the methods are simply inappropriate. We're going to start our conversation today by asking another couple of questions. Like, for instance, how do you know that George Washington was the first president of the United States? Or what makes you so sure that the sun is going to rise tomorrow? How do you know that you really have a stomach, or feet, or arms, legs, and eyes? How is it that you could be sure that there aren't little creatures inside computers that are responsible for the things that computers do? Are you sure that you don't have a big hole in the back of your pants? Authority is one of the first sources of knowledge. We know or believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States because we trust the authority of historians and history books. During the centuries that Western civilization was dominated by the church, the authority of holy writings was believed to be the only dependable way to know. Reason was also considered by the Renaissance scholars to be the most reliable source of knowledge. If you say all humans have stomachs, I'm human, therefore I have a stomach, you have used deductive reasoning. If you say the sun rose today, yesterday, the day before yesterday, and for as long as I or anyone else can remember, the sun rose, you are using inductive reasoning. Observation is yet another way of acquiring knowledge. You know the color of my shirt, which happens to be purple, because you can see the shirt. You assume that you do not have a hole in the back of your clothing because you have not seen a hole, or you haven't noticed that anyone stares or giggles when you pass by. One might use any of these ways of knowing to deny the existence of little creatures in computers. People you perceive to be authorities about computer insides may have told you how they work. You may have reasoned that creatures need nourishment and there's no food supply inside those microprocessors. Or you may have looked inside a computer and failed to see little creatures waiting to solve some of your problems. But there is no way that one can absolutely refute the computer creature hypothesis. So if you want to keep your computer running, maybe you should find out what little creatures eat. All these ways of knowing, whether it's authority, reason, observation, they're all used by scientists and even students, but observation must be the basis for knowledge that is scientific. Science, puts greater emphasis on evidence that's provided by the senses than on authority of others or using just reasoning. In short, science relies on what we call empirical evidence. Now, a common refrain voiced by lay people and some scientists is that most, if not all, of behavioral science is just plain common sense. Introductory psychology students are particularly apt to make this claim, given that much of their prior exposure to psychology is likely to have been commonsensical, though perhaps not well established, claims by the variety of professionals on the talk show circuit. In a nutshell, it's difficult to counter the common sense stigma when so much behavior seems to be explained by an intuitive level of knowledge. Mark Levy shares some suggestions for discussing this issue. It's true that subject matter related to psychology is much more familiar to most people than is the subject matter of, let's say, subatomic physics or gastroendocrinological studies, biology. We see behavior all around us, but rarely do we ever stumble upon a gluon. Psychology would be an odd science if we thought and realized that behavior was only considered thoughts and behaviors completely foreign to people's experience or of its findings if those findings ran counter to what most people believed. But neither greater visibility of subject matter nor popular consensus will guarantee greater understanding. Many people believe wholeheartedly in flat earths and cheese moons only to find their common sense views dismantled in the face of scientific evidence. So too with psychology. Although most people would like to believe that large rewards produce greater liking for a boring task, that the behavior of men and women is determined by their biology, or that absence makes the heart truly grow fonder, researchers studying cognitive dissonance, sex role stereotypes, and close relationships would be happy to share their findings to the contrary. At the end of the day, the popularity of a common sense belief may not always support the weight of scientific evidence. More importantly, psychologists, like every other type of scientists, are primarily engaged in the task of explaining behavior rather than merely cataloging it. The difference between theory and description, why versus what, echoes the difference between science and common sense. Common sense certainly helps describe what takes place in behavior, but does not compel us to understand why it takes place. The development of theory in understanding behavior sets science apart from everyday common sense accounts. So as we continue to move through this conversation related to the science of biology, there are some things we need to consider as we become what I would call good reasoners. For example, reasoning has a purpose. Those who reason well state their purpose clearly. They are willing to distinguish it from other related purposes. They adopt realistic and significant purposes and goals, and they even monitor their thinking for consistency. Also, those who reason well understand that reasoning is an attempt to figure something out, to settle some question, to solve a problem. Those good reasoners are clear about the question they're trying to settle and can express it clearly. Those good reasoners can also break a question into sub-questions, distinguishing significant from trivial and relevant as well as irrelevant pieces of information. Good reasoners can distinguish the questions they can answer versus the questions they can't. They can also be sensitive to the assumptions that are built into the questions they ask, simply because they're questions. Reasoning is also done from some particular point of view. Again, those who reason well will keep in mind that people have different points of view, especially on issues that are controversial. Consistently articulating other points of view and reason from within those points of view are also characteristics of good reasoners. Those individuals will also seek other viewpoints, especially when the issue is one they believe in passionately. Some good reasoners will also have insight into areas and problems where they are most likely to be prejudiced. Number 4, good reasoners will also assert a claim only when they have sufficient evidence to back it up. Good reasoners can articulate and therefore evaluate the evidence behind their claims. They actively search for information against, not just for, their own proposition. Such individuals also are willing to key in on relevant information and disregarded information or data that are irrelevant to the question at hand. Such individuals also draw conclusions only to the extent they are able to support those conclusions by the data. They are also willing to state their evidence clearly and fairly. Now, reasoning tends to be expressed through and shaped by concepts and ideas. As such, good reasoners are aware of the key concepts and ideas that they use. They're able to explain the basic implications of the key words and phrases they use. Those reasoners are also able to distinguish their special, non-structured, and non-standard uses of words from standard uses. They're aware of irrelevant concepts and ideas. They use concepts and ideas in ways that are relevant to their true function. They can also distinguish superficial from deeper concepts. Reasoning is also based on assumptions, and good reasoners make assumptions that are clear. They make assumptions that are reasonable as well as consistent with each other. Reasoning will often lead somewhere. It will often have its own implications and consequences. And such reasoners are clearly articulate. They are able to provide significant implications and consequences of their reasoning. They search for negative as well as for positive consequences. They anticipate the likelihood of unexpected negative as well as positive implications. Now, reasoning also contains inferences by which we give meaning to data and come to conclusions. Those who reason well will make inferences that are clear and precise. They will usually make inferences that follow from the evidence or reasons presented. They often make inferences that are deep rather than superficial, while making inferences or coming to conclusions that are reasonable. They make inferences or come to conclusions that are consistent with each other. What this boils down to in very plain language is that when people make assertions, whatever those assertions might be, for example, the sky outside today is gray because it's been raining, I base that particular statement on the clear evidence that I can see a gray sky outside. I could tell you that the sky is purple, but I have no data to substantiate the fact that the sky would or would not be purple. In other words, my comment is erroneous and does not apply. People who reason well are aware of such difficulties. Now let's take a look just for a moment at some of the biographical profiles of those individuals in the past who have been major contributors to psychology. Sergeant Joe Friday famously intoned, "Just the facts, ma'am." That comes from a TV show way back in the 60s, for those of you who wouldn't know such a comment. If you'd like to share some of those facts about some pioneers in psychology, the snippets that I'm going to give you might be of some kind of interest. Wilhelm Wundt was born in Germany. Wilhelm was the fourth child of a Lutheran minister. Despite coming from a family that boasted numerous scholars as well as scientists and physicians, Wundt was initially not a good student. After he dropped out of one high school, the teacher suggested that a reasonable goal for him would be a career in the postal service. This guy actually has scholastic abilities that did improve over time, and however, in 1855 he graduated at the top of his class in medical school. He then went on to Berlin to study physiology with Johannes Müller, and he subsequently decided to become an experimental physiologist himself. He then returned to the University of Heidelberg, where he worked as an assistant for Hermann Helmholtz. It was at Heidelberg that Wundt taught his first course in psychology, and that year was 1862. In 1879, the University of Leipzig, where he held a chair in philosophy, he established an Institute for Experimental Psychology, the first laboratory whose formal purpose was the scientific investigation of the human mind. Another man by the name of Edward Titchener. He was an Englishman and a student of Dr. Wundt's. He also taught at Cornell University during the late 18th and early 20th centuries. He's best known as a major proponent of what we now call structuralism, that focused on investigating the structure of conscious experience. Now, Sigmund Freud is another fellow that we will come across a great deal as we study psychology together. He lived between 1856 and 1939, born in Czechoslovakia. He was a gifted student, but it took him 8 years to finish his medical degree at the University of Vienna, partly because he couldn't decide exactly what he wanted to study. He studied everything. He first pursued a career as a neurologist, but financial concerns forced him into general medical practice. Through other circumstances like trial and error and feedback from his clients, Breuer, as well as Freud, developed a technique known nowadays as psychoanalysis. All kinds of other particular things that Sigmund Freud is famous for. His first major book is called The Interpretation of Dreams, written in 1900. It detailed the process of dream interpretation, which he felt was the royal road to the unconscious. Another former scholar by the name of William James lived between 1842 and 1910. He is considered the father of American psychology, born in New York City, but he spent much of his childhood traveling between the United States and Europe, where he attended private schools. James's interest is so varied that it included fields of philosophy, religion, science, as well as being cultivated at home in an enriched environment he shared with his brother Henry. William James struggled to find a vocation that suited his various interests. He eventually decided on medicine and received his MD from Harvard in 1868. John Watson lived between 1878 and 1958. He's best known for his insistence that, as a true science, psychology's research methods must be objective and its subject matter is what we call observable. In other words, you have to see it to believe it. In 1908, he left the University of Chicago to join the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, where he entered the limelight of academia with the publication of an article in which he clearly stated the behavioralist point of view. A manifesto of sorts, the paper argued that psychology must become an objective science, an experimental branch of the natural sciences whose goal would be to predict and control behavior. The whole range of human behavior fascinated Watson, and as early as 1917 he had begun studies into human sexual response. He observed sexual behavior in laboratory animals, but wanted to explore the more complex changes that occurred in humans. The tenor of the times required the utmost discretion in pursuing this avenue of research. Watson used himself as a subject in his sexual response research, which is a no-no. We don't ever use our own selves for scientific experiment. He secretly monitored his female laboratory assistant and himself during their sexual intercourse. Also an ethical breach. When Watson's wife discovered the content of his experiments, she sued for divorce and had all of his records confiscated and destroyed. A major scandal resulted. Watson was dismissed from Johns Hopkins University and married his research assistant. He was unable to find an academic institution who would allow him a position on its faculty. He finally turned to private industry for employment in 1921. Although Watson did continue to publish papers in scientific journals, he never again gained the recognition from the scientific community. He died embittered at the age of 80. There's B.F. Skinner from 1904 to 1990. We'll talk about the Skinner box as well as other pieces of information related to reinforcement, whether that's structured or unstructured. Remember that when Skinner was at Harvard, he was heavily influenced by the work of Watson. From his influence, Skinner also dedicated his life to studying the relationship between reinforcement and observable behavior. Max Wittenheimer, as well as Kurt Kafka, were early Gestalt psychologists who argued that psychology or psychological experience can't be reduced to its basic elements. Rather, they asserted that behavior and thought as a whole must be studied in order to understand the psychological experience. Last on our reference list is Abraham Maslow. Born in 1908, he died in 1970. He is what we call, or was what we call, a humanistic psychologist, best known for his development of a hierarchy of needs that must be fulfilled in order for an individual to reach self-actualization, the ability to realize one's unique potential as a human being. Maslow received his PhD at the University of Wisconsin in 1934. He then taught at Wisconsin for a year, followed by appointments at Teachers College at Columbia University, Brooklyn College, and finally at Brandeis University, where he spent most of his academic career. He moved to Menlo Park in California in 1969 as a resident fellow of the Laughlin Foundation. We'll talk a whole lot more about Dr. Maslow as the semester moves along. Now, to drill down just a little bit further, I'd like to take us on a little bit of a road trip, as it were, to consider some very specific ideas. And I'll start first with a small definition. What specifically is psychology? It's basically the study of mental activities and behavior. There are a number of subfields that come underneath that category. The breadth of psychology is very broad. There's developmental psychology, which considers how people develop across the lifespan. There's physiological psychology, which would include the study of how it is that physiological processes influence mental circumstances as well as behavioral responses. Experimental psychology deals with just that, experiments. It deals strongly with statistical information and observable behavior. Personality psychology deals with personality and the myriad different types of personalities and how those personalities influence mental processes as well as behavior. There's clinical and counseling psychology, which takes into consideration psychological assessment for the clinical aspect, and counseling psychology considers how it is that counseling influences psychological behaviors as well as mental processes. Social psychology speaks about how it is that social constructs deal or influence mental processes as well as psychological and other mental concerns. Industrial and organizational psychology deals with industry as well as larger organizations and how they function as systems. Now, to push a little further on that particular idea, it's important to remember that this particular class on general psychology, first of all, is simply a scattershot. It's going to give you the broad categories of how it is that we deal with psychological issues related to mental process as well as behavioral concerns. I'm only going to give you the high points across the whole semester. There will be episodes when we dive a whole lot more deeply into specific subject areas, but generally speaking, we're just going to be hitting the high spots. If you want to know more significant information or deeper information, you can remember that if you get a bachelor's degree in psychology, you now have the table of contents to the book that we call psychology. There's a whole lot of information in there that we cannot cover in this particular class. Some other issues to remember as we work through psychology this semester, during our little term anyway, is that the person and the situation are always significant. We'll deal with the nature versus nurture concern. We'll deal with stability versus change, dealing with personality, lifespan, social concerns, behavioral issues, whatnot. We'll also deal with diversity as well as universality. We'll consider how things are different, why they might be different. In other words, questions like, do I experience physical pain the same way a person in India experiences physical pain? How do social issues influence that level of pain? Those sorts of questions. And we'll also deal with the mind-body connection. All of these concerns in every chapter to some degree or other. Now, psychology as a science boils down to 2 or 3 particular things. One of those happens to be theory. What happens as a part of research is that people develop a theory or a working idea of why or how things come to be the way they are. As a part of that theory, then individuals develop what we call hypotheses. In other words, because I think that personality involves XYZ concerns, my hypothesis is that this particular concern creates that sort of problem, which then gives me the position of being able to predict whether or not that problem is truly a problem or whether it might not be a problem. But that prediction then becomes a way that we can use mathematics as well as statistical information to validate or invalidate my particular hypothesis and theory. Now, when it comes to theories and hypotheses and predictions, it's important to remember that we are going to be critical thinkers. I will ask you often why it is you think what you think. Where did you come to understand that belief? Is it something someone in your family told you? Please understand, if you tell me that your mother told you that it was so, I will chuckle and say I'm going to need a little more information than that, because mom said will not suffice for this class. Remember that people who think critically are thinking like scientists. They want to define a particular problem. They're going to suggest a specific explanation. They'll take a look at the evidence, usually having gathered that information for themselves. They will then analyze particular assumptions. They will avoid oversimplifying. They'll draw their conclusions carefully. They will consider alternate possibilities, and then they'll recognize the relevance of the current research that is available. As a result of all of those things, when you put them all together, you get some sort of psychological idea about how things work, at least as it comes to behavioral concerns. Now, what about growth as for psychology as a particular science? The growth of psychology is long. It is an ancient study to some degree or other. The history is long and actually began with the ancient Greeks. After the ancient Greeks, we encountered individuals like Rene Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. Then there's John Locke, another individual by the name of Charles Darwin. You know him most, I'm sure, as it relates to the development of the evolutionary aspects of human history that we developed across a evolutionary continuum. Again, I'm not asking you if you think that's correct or incorrect. I'm simply telling you that's what Charles Darwin thought. Now, the new psychology is what we call a psychology of the mind. It involved Dr. Wundt, I mentioned just a few minutes ago, who wrote and studied volunteerism versus structuralism. William James, I also mentioned, brought out a concept called functionalism. Sigmund Freud brought us psychodynamics, as well as the psychodynamic personality theories. Now, Sigmund Freud becomes the foundation upon which virtually everything that you and I would call contemporary psychology has been constructed. He has set the foundation for virtually all of the study of current psychology. Now, please bear in mind one particular little idiosyncrasy. The largest portion of Sigmund Freud's suggested information was not based on real solid research. In fact, contemporary research takes a large portion of what Sigmund Freud viewed as being appropriate and has debunked it as psychological theory. Now, while the largest part of Freud's theory has been debunked, from my perspective and the way I do psychology, a large portion of some of his theories are very important to how I do my work. And we'll talk about those across the course of the semester. We'll also be looking at Watson and Skinner and the idea of behavioralism as well as behavioral reinforcement, both positive and negative. There's the cognitive revolution, which includes Gestalt therapy as well as humanistic psychology, as well as the rise of what is most popular in this particular time as cognitive psychology. If someone encounters therapy nowadays, they usually will encounter some level of cognitive behavioral therapy, what we know as CBT. Now, there are some new directions that people are moving in psychology. People are exploring the evolutionary aspects of psychological processes. There's also what we call positive psychology and any other number of perspectives that relate to psychological processes today. Don't forget at all that a great many women have also been involved in psychological concerns. Many of those disciplines have not been kind to women, and women have recently begun to come to the fore of psychological understanding. Again, remember, we'll talk about human diversity, which is significantly important. Gender is a very specific issue and a political hot topic in our culture. I want to point out something too that's very important that will encompass part of our discussion across the semester. These kinds of discussions are always great fun when we have them in person, and we'll do the best we can considering our avenue of study this particular short term. Gender is a cultural construct. Sex is not. Let me explain. When it comes to people who are born, human creatures, they are born. They come forth from the mother. There are two sexes. There is male, there is female. That is quote unquote sex. Gender is what the cultural construct has decided represents male or female. Example, in many contexts, men, not always, but men often do the largest portion of outside yard work. A lot of women don't, for whatever reason. Culture has decided that outdoor yard work is more male-oriented than female-oriented. That doesn't make it better or worse. That just makes it what it is. What people consider to be normal, quote-unquote, housemaking chores or duties, vacuuming, laundry, dishes, and whatnot, from the 1950s back tended to be a little more female-oriented. Again, that's a cultural emphasis that has nothing to do with whether a person is a male or a female. In our house, if anybody vacuums, I do. It's not because I have a feminine twist, it's because I like to vacuum. There is something that helps me when I vacuum with my OCD. I can vacuum in a straight row. I can see the progress of my work. The vacuum picks up garbage off of the floor. Those sorts of things. It meets a different need for me. That doesn't suggest that I am female inclined in any way. It just means I'm a guy who vacuums. My wife has been known to mow the yard. She hasn't done that in a number of years, but she's not opposed to mowing the yard. Trust me, that does not make her a guy by any stretch of the imagination. So gender stereotypes are critical. One of the significant challenges related to our current political and cultural conversations may involve the difference between what is considered to be sex, again, female or male, and what is considered to be gender, which is culturally constructed. We'll talk about that a lot. We have feminist psychology. It's also becoming quite important. Remember that each one of these categories has their own particular individuals who propose or debunk, whatever you want to call it, their particular ideas related to psychological practice. The feminist perspective views, and I'm speaking in very broad, general terms, views that every challenge related to being feminine is because men or males have not always behaved well. Now that's a very broad brushstroke. It's a very generalized statement which can be problematic depending on the environment, but just bear in mind that feminism not only is still rising, but is very prominent in psychological fields. Sexual orientation, which by the way is another hot topic in our political and cultural scenarios these days. Sexual orientation, I'd be curious to know, and you can pop on the discussion line if you'd like to answer this concept. Is sexual orientation related to being male or female, or is it related to gender? Some combination of all of those. You tell me. I'd be more than happy to hear what it is you have to say about that. There are race and ethnic concerns related to psychological views. Who is considered to be a minority versus who is considered to be the majority? Those sorts of elements influence psychological development. Now, as another topic, we'll deal with research methods in psychology. Now, there's all kinds of ways to do research, all kinds of methods. You can use naturalistic observation, which is basically someone watching. The example I use in the classroom when we're meeting face to face, there could be someone in the room or someone outside the room who could see in, observing the behavior in the room. There might be questions like, of 10 students in the room, how many of those students are right-handed versus how many of those students are left-handed? How many of those students have trouble sitting still versus how many students don't? Those sorts of questions, but that comes from watching and from observing people in their natural habitat, to use that language. We can use case studies, which are, it can be one of two things. You can use an individual as a case study, or you can use a group of individuals all having the same characteristics that form the quote-unquote individual part of the case study. There are surveys, all kinds of ways to do surveys. You can use what's called a Likert scale, on a scale of 1 to 7 as it relates to being angry or not angry. Number 7 being, I'm so angry I want to kill somebody, and you assess for yourself where you are on that scale from 1 to 7. That's a survey of sorts. Correlational research compares notions related to two different ideas. We've got experimental research, which involves actual experiments related to statistical information. We can also understand that when it comes to psychological research, good research must be replicatable, meaning that if I do it in one circumstance, the same sort of experiment should give me similar results the second time I do it, and continually. Multi-method research includes both experimental as well as scientific methodologies related to research, all kinds of ways to get to the information. The data is always important. You can use random samples, you can use representative samples, but bear in mind that those samples will be sensitive to the diversity that's represented in those samples. Another significant aspect that we'll talk about across our term is ethics related to psychological practice. The state boards, at least in this country, as a clinical psychologist, I am subject to the Texas Board of Examiners of Psychologists, which has been gathered into another group of individuals these days. It has a new name. I think it's the Texas Behavioral Council, something to that effect. But there's a set of ethical guidelines that I must follow in the practice of my work. If I violate one of those regulations, I'm subject to having my license revoked. So it's important that I play by the rules, as it were. There are rules that allow for the protection and the rights and the well-being of the participants, both mine and my clients. There's also what we call informed consent. Informed consent is an agreement that is carried on between a clinician and the client. And the client might be a person, could be more than one individual, like a couple or a family. But the document, basically, a written document, is the establishment of a particular type of relationship between a clinician and someone else. As a part of that informed consent, there are a couple of specifications. I, for example, will not speak with anyone else about whatever it is we talk about when we do therapy work, with the following exceptions. If you tell me you're going to hurt yourself or someone else, or you know of someone who is very young or very old who's being abused in some way, there's somebody I need to call. There's also the concern if you tell me you're going to hurt yourself or someone else, there's somebody I need to call. Texas regulations specify that I must make a call. It's not something that I want or necessarily desire in any way to do. It's just some part of the law that requires that I do so. You can also specify to whom I can release information. If I'm working with a married couple, it's very common for either spouse to say that I can give information to the other person. That would be normal. There is also an ethical concern about being false as it relates to research. You can lie, and I use that word loosely, you can lie when you're doing psychological research when there is ample justification. There's also the challenge related to how deception is used as a part of research. And we'll talk about that in an experiment related to Dr. Milgram a little bit later in the term. There is the right of the person participating in the research to withdraw at any time without any kind of consequence. It's important that you debrief participants in research after the conclusion of the study. There's always the notion of confidentiality related to who knows that whoever or does not know whoever is involved in an experiment. You must anticipate, as a research scientist, the possible necessity to remove or correct concerns that come up in the midst of an experiment. For example, if I was going to do an experiment that related to monkeys, using monkeys as our experimentees, how I treat them is extremely important. If for some reason some sort of disease breaks out among my monkeys, then it's possible that I would have to stop my experiment, as an example. It would depend on a number of other circumstances. Speaking of animals, how it is we use animals in psychological research is critical. It is easier to control animals than it is human creatures, which is why we use them, but it's also because they have simpler behavior and can be studied in ways that are not permissible to humans. Now, there are some significant standards related to how we care for animals. For example, when dealing with animals as it comes to research, if at some point it is necessary to kill the animal, it must be done quickly and under anesthesia. In other words, they're going to go to sleep before they die. They won't know the difference. All experimentation related to animals must be pain-free. If there's any way to measure pain, it must be taken care of at some level or other. There is an episode of MASH, the TV show. Most of you, I would hope, have at least heard about it. If you haven't, you should look it up. There's an episode when the ovaries of a rabbit are needed to make a pregnancy test, which is what used to be the standard. Bear in mind, we're talking about the late 40s and the early 50s when this TV show is set as a part of its history. They borrow Radar's rabbit, they do surgery on the rabbit under anesthesia. They took out the rabbit's ovaries and put the rabbit back together again. Now, way back in the day, what would have occurred is that they would have killed the rabbit, basically, and taken what was necessary from the rabbit and just let the rabbit die. Again, they would have done that under anesthesia, but the rabbit would have died. In contemporary psychological understanding, it would not be necessary to do that. You could work with the animal without having to kill an animal. And when that's possible, that's how it rolls. So, science as a part of psychology is a very complicated idea. It's a place where we get started. I promise you, across our term together, you will have opportunity to hear some of my clinical stories. I'm very open about my own clinical experience. I'm very open about my own actions with therapy. I don't mind talking about them. I've done my work, as it were, and it's very easy for me to talk about. I'll tell you about some of my own human experience, not only as a dad, but as a single father, married to a woman who was killed in a part of a traffic accident involving my oldest child, things like that. We'll talk about all kinds of fun stuff across the term. Just bear in mind, I will push you. I will ask you things that you're probably not accustomed to thinking about. That's on purpose. That's part of my job. If I can get you to think about some circumstance in a way different from how you thought about it yesterday, I'm not telling you what the conclusion has to be. I'm just saying if I can provoke your new thought, then I've done my work. My job is to expose you to psychology, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull back the curtain, and I'm going to show you all kinds of things related to this field. I'm looking forward to our time together.